to everybody. I'm very happy and pleased this morning to host this seminar and speech by Ambassador Damir Grubiša, who's here to speak about Croatian membership in the new Europe. And I would like first to thank who made this possible. So I'd like to thank Punto Europa, Professor Bianchini and Previtera, and everybody who helped organize this seminar. I think it's a very interesting opportunity, a rare opportunity, I think, in the faculty, in the ex-faculty, in the School of Political Science, in the Forlì campus here. It's a rare opportunity to have a diplomat who can speak about such an important issue as the Croatian membership as the 28th member of the European Union. So I'm very happy and honored to have Damir Grubiša here, and also to have two other important members of this session this morning, who are Patrick Leach and Professor Bescher, I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, and who will also talk about Croatian membership. And Patrick Leach is a professor here at the University of Forlì, but he's also the assessor alla cultura of the Comune of Forlì. So I will give him now to say a few words.
Thank you very much. In some ways, perhaps I'm an example of the European mission of Forlì at this moment, having been nominated assessor or city councillor for culture and international relations. For those who don't know me may hear from my accent. So I have a very good English accent because indeed I was born and brought up in Britain. So in a sense that was perhaps the mission of the City Council, to open itself more to Europe. Just one or two words of welcome to Damir Grubiša, the Ambassador for Croatia. An important occasion for us to see exactly how the entry of Croatia into Europe, which is very close now, 1st of July, will influence Italy, will influence Europe, and will influence also Forlì. I say Forlì because the City Council and the city in general has a large number of links with the world of the Balkan world, and including Croatia. So the university has an international mission in terms of the School of Political Science, and also the Department of Interpreting and Translation, from which I come. But in other respects, also the city has a lot of links with the Balkan area. I'll just mention one, which is a large project on the Southeast Europe programme called Atrium, Architecture of Totalitarian Regimes in Urban Management, which includes 18 partners in 11 different countries in Southeast Europe. So that's very much, I think, already part of the reasoning with the City Council, in some respects, Croatia and the Balkan area. So a very warm welcome again. I won't say anything else, except I think the questions are really perhaps what the process of accession to the European Union has meant for Croatia. That seems to be an important theme over the last 10 years. And again, exactly how that will influence both Italy and perhaps also Europe. So warm welcome, thank you very much. Buon lavoro.
Well, thank you first of all to Europe Direct, who made possible this important event. Actually, we are in a sense celebrating with some hours of delay the Europe Day by emphasizing the newcomer and the role of the newcomer to the European Union. Croatia will join us next July 1st. And I would say very rapidly, because it will be very interesting to hear our guests, what are their own expectations, and what is also their own idea, their role that Croatia can play within our let's say bloc within the European Union integration processes. But I would say that this is the outcome of a long and very traumatic process that began with the collapse of socialism in Yugoslavia, followed by the collapse of the country. And the collapse of the country was a bloody collapse, violent, with lots of tensions, where despite the mythology that was developed in Croatia by the president of that time, Mr. Tudjman, who pretended to have a deeply European orientation of Croatia in contrast to the orientation of other Yugoslav successor states, this was to a large extent also critically considered from the European member states, at least for all the 90s. And actually Croatia began to start a new policy only when Tudjman died and a radical political change occurred in the country in 2000. And we have to say that since then, despite the different coalition that change into the government in the leadership of the country, the strategy of participating to the process of integration didn't change, which was more or less the same orientation that happened into the other former socialist countries, from Poland, Estonia to Bulgaria, when after the collapse of socialism, all the coalitions that took their own office in their own countries didn't change this strategical goal that was achieved actually in 2004 and 2007. And this is the reason why, in a sense, following similar pattern, Croatia was able to achieve this goal in 2013. Now the question is, to what extent also this example that is coming from Croatia will be beneficial for the whole Southeast Europe, for the other countries that are candidate or potential candidate that would like to join the Union. Whether, to what extent this, common goal in foreign policy that characterized different coalition and different parties will represent a value for reforms, transformation, adaptation, dialogue. Maybe we can see some kind of impact in this sense through the new context of dialogue that has been established between Serbia and Kosovo, for instance, recently, despite all the difficulties and the stop-and-go relationships that still remain even in the implementation. This can be also an interesting element for the future reconciliation. I know that a new meeting between the two presidents of Serbia and Croatia has been announced in Macedonia beginning of June, for instance. We'll see whether and to what extent these examples can also influence the relationships between parties, coalitions in Macedonia as well. Bosnia probably remain the most problematic country for the next future because of the difficulties in organization of the decision-making process. But anyhow, what is important is that a clear sign, a clear message has been sent to Southeast Europe by the European Union, EU member states and the Commission, despite all the reluctances that still we have about enlargements. I mean, particularly the mentality connected to this absorption fatigue that the European member states are very often claiming, or the impact of the economic crisis. So this is a clear message. Enlargement is still a process that will continue and offer new opportunities for a European space that need still stabilization and reconciliation. So from this point of view, the changes and the inclusion, the membership of Croatia can be extremely relevant for the region, and we expect, in a sense, I would say, and I would like to know from the ambassador to hear some words, what Croatia would like to do for strengthening stabilization and reconciliation in Southeast Europe from the moment when Croatia will join formally the Union. So I'm very glad to have here Damir Grubiša, the ambassador, and a very prominent journalist, although also a professor in our university, Professor Bešker, because we would like to hear from their own words what are their own expectations, hopes, and what are the strategies that we can expect from Croatia in Southeast Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Before giving the word to Professor Bešker, I would like to say that there will be 20 minutes in the end for questions. You can either ask questions in Italian or English, so please, you're welcome to do this at the end. So think about it while the seminar is going on. And now I have Professor Bešker have his speech.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Of course, I'm not born and neither rising in the United Kingdom, so my accent is what it is. I'm rising in Dalmatia, but don't look, I don't have those black dots specific for Dalmatians. Anyway, His Excellency Ambassador Grubiša will speak all the best about Croatia, because he is now ambassador. In his previous life, he used to be a very eminent professor of political sciences, but now I suppose that he is stripped off of that possibility to speak about the other part of the reality, and in that case, let's do it. So, okay. I think I'm going to speak about the burden which Croatia is going to bring in the Union, and not only about, and because of that burden depend the expectations of Croatia, of the members of Croatian political nation, the members of Croatian ethnic groups, and so I'm going to jump this part and just tell you some figures about Croatia. It's a country of a little more than you'll see it, I suppose it, a little more than 4 million inhabitants. Its GDP is something total is $80 billion, and that doing over it 75th country of the 200 countries in the world, and this its GDP for my students, društveni bruto proizvod, is less, or let's say 0.5% of GDP, 0.5% of GDP of European Union. So it's what French should say, quantité négligeable. It's not a quantity which will make a difference, not in a positive and neither in a negative for the Union. So this is not a great burden. And the GDP per capita in PPP is something about 18,000 euros a year, which makes Croatia. Yes, dollars. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. Me too. Anyway, makes us the 48th nation in the world, but we are among the among the last 5 of 28 in the Union. And that's our economic output 3 years ago. You can see that the services, tertiary, is 66% of GDP and 64% of workforce. Industrial, secondary, 27.2, with a little more workforce engaged, and agriculture 6.8, with less than 3% of the workforce engaged. So that means that Croatia is mainly oriented towards services. But let's say it, our export, always 3 years ago, was more than 8 billions of euros, and import was almost 15. So a little less than a double. And that is the first of the great problems we have. Or rather say the political garnitures in the last 20 years made of Croatia import-oriented country, and that contributed to the great level of public, of state, of sovereign debt. I'm not going to explain this expert tree map. It's just that you can see that our shipyards, which are now annihilated, were the most export-oriented industrial force. Anyway, and this is I think this is important. In Croatia, the state still controls a significant part of the economy. Something about 40% of GDP. Then we have a very slow and not very transparent judiciary system, inefficient public administration, and quite a high level of corruption. Anyway, the processes of entering in European Union really contributed to lower the levels of those calamities we have in our country. So, for instance, in a judiciary system, the situation is still terrific, but slightly better than in Italy. So here we enter, I'm sorry, anyway. So we are, let's say, on the same level of the other southern members of the European Union, like Portugal, like Spain, like Greece. And I don't know nothing about Cyprus. Maybe it's Christos who is going to tell us something about that. No. Okay, let's go farther. So, 2 years ago, my country was ranked 66th by Transparency International. Let's see, the GDP per capita in PPS at December the 1st of the last year. You can see that Croatia is in this, I would say, in this middle group. We are something little more or little less than 60% of average GDP per capita in European Union. And you can see that we belong to the same group with Hungary, with Poland, with the Baltic states. So, a kind of average. Those are the GDPs per capita. The crisis lowered it. Ultimately, the expectations by the government are the growth rate for this year positive by 0.8, and experts say negative from 1 to 2%. We're going to see the result at the end of this year. Anyway. Now you can compare what the crisis did to Croatia and to the European Union and even to Italy, just to make of course I'm not going to show you all 27 countries because it should be redundant, but you can see that, you can imagine that the reasons of the bad performance of Croatia are not only external, because the crisis in Croatia, this economic crisis, this wave of economic crisis in Croatia began before the Lehman Brothers and so much about real GDP growth in next year, provision by Eurostat. You can see that we remain in the same group with the southern European countries and, my, Netherlands. And that means in the lowest group, less than 0 or something, or less, anyway, less than 1%. That's provision by Eurostat. Of course, I take it as I offer you as I have taken it. One of the great burdens of Croatia, but with that number, with that population is not so important, is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is one of the highest in the European Union. As you can see, we will reach maybe 18% at the end of this year, maybe. It's one of provisions, I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm not sure. I don't have a glass sphere. And let's see how Croatia answers to the Maastricht criteria and unemployment. Inflation rate is higher than, it should be something about 3.2% now, 1.5% over the average of the three best performing. About annual government deficit, we are going to reach, they say, or better to say, Croatian National Bank says that we are going to reach 6.5%, and that's very bad. Anyway, according to them, government debt is less than 60%, but there are some other experts who say that it is higher, that it reaches even 80%. Anyway, here those here, what you see? Oh, I'm sorry. Anyway, it's those are the figures brought up by Statistic Institute of Croatia. So much about figures, and now what are the expectations of the Croatian population? Of course, they first thought that entering the Union will bring us a great number of new opportunities. Now it seems, during the crisis which affected the Union more than the other developed parts of the Western world, we have a real deflation of that kind of expectations among the people, in the media, etc. But the main result achieved till now, and the main reason to join the Union for Croatia was a tour de force to reach the standards, the European standards of transparency, the European standards of efficiency, etc. Of course, we are far from standards in efficiency of the northern Protestant countries, but we are southern Catholic country. What can we do with it? It's our burden.
And our ambassador, Damir Grubiša.
Thank you for inviting me here. My friend Professor Beschker told you that I would probably depict a rosy picture of Croatia since I'm a diplomat. Usually a diplomat is conceived as an honest person sent abroad to lie in the interest of his country. But I'm not a professional diplomat, I'm a political appointee. And I used to teach before, and therefore I stick to a kind of honesty which I would call intellectual honesty. For that reason, I am always tending to analyze the situation also with its problems and contradictions. Let me try. First, Croatia is going to enter the European Union on the 1st of July of this year, and this is really a turning of a new page in the history of Croatia. However, Croatia is lagging behind 9 years behind the other transition countries, post-communist countries that entered the European Union in 2004. Why is that so? Especially when you compare with our first neighbors, the Republic of Slovenia, that succeeded in entering the European Union on the 1st of May, 1st of June 2004. First, we have to consider the mistakes committed by the Croatian governments, the various Croatian governments, and especially a Croatian government that we had from 1991 to the year 2000. These were the 10 lost years of our transition, because we had a strong authoritarian government inspired by a nationalist ideology that, of course, was holding some basic misperceptions about Europe and the world encircling Croatia. First, of course, you have to take into account that the first multi-party elections brought various political parties to the scene. All these political parties shared the idea of a European Croatia, of Croatia becoming part of the European, at that time, community. The problem was in the interpretation. How are we going to achieve this European identity of Croatia? When the war started, then it came to the surface that our concepts of Europe are quite different. For instance, the concept of Europe held by the nationalist movement that won the elections in 1990 and led by President Tudjman, a former hardline communist who turned to be a dissident and then a nationalist and then, of course, a leader of the nationalist movement, independentist movement. His idea of Europe was the idea of return to Europe, and Croatia that has maintained for centuries the role of antemurale Christianitatis. What does it mean? The defender of Christianity. His idea of Europe was almost the same as the idea of Europe in many nationalist movements in Eastern Europe, which meant we are going to return to Europe as our family, but not to a new modern Europe, but as the Europe was between the two world wars. What does it mean? It means that practically they just cancelled 40 years of communism and tended to join Europe as it was before the Second World War, the Europe of nationalisms, the Europe of conflicts, territorial, and so on. One example, for instance, the first foreign minister of Hungary, a very well-known historian, Géza Jeszenski, was enthusiastic about this European orientation of Hungary, and he said, of course, Hungary would now have to fight to incorporate parts of Slovakia and Romania where Hungarians live into the big Hungary. And everybody started with a big Croatia, with a big Serbia, of course, that started the war, with a big Romania, with a big Slovakia, with a big Czechia, with a big Poland, everybody tried to maximize the idea of national independence. So when we were joining this European movement, we joined it in a wrong way, because we were practically joining an idea of Europe as it used to be between the Second World Wars, between the First and the Second World Wars. This has been proven in many examples. For instance, the European community at that time tried, after the recognition of independence of Croatia and Slovenia, to drag all the countries of former Yugoslavia to the European Union. It was not possible with the Serbs, because at that time they were fighting a war for a greater Serbia, but it was possible for the two republics that declared independence, Slovenia and Croatia. For instance, one of the basic prerequisites for the international recognition of Croatia was that Croatia should have adopted a constitutional law on ethnic rights and the observance of human rights. Croatia did it, but it did in a specific way. When it proclaimed this law, there was an additional wording in the promulgation of the war in the official gazette, in the official journal, saying that this law on the respect of human rights and the rights of ethnic minorities will not be implemented until Croatia is not reintegrated in its territories. What did it mean? That practically this law and human rights will not be applied during the war, during the hostilities. And of course there was an ambiguous sentence: what does it mean, the integration of Croatia, when we know that President Tudjman had a hidden agenda to incorporate vast parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina into a greater Croatia. So practically it was very ambiguous, but the European community, of course, was very lenient towards Croatia and said, okay, we shall see when the war will finish, then we shall give another interpretation of that. Then, of course, in order to drag Croatia towards the European community, when in 1993 the Visegrad countries joined together in order to exercise the community method among themselves and create the prerequisites for a multilateral compromise and to see how would they function in a future European community, then Croatia refused to join this group, saying that those countries are lagging behind us in social standard, in welfare, and even in political mentality. Therefore we refused, because the leadership at that time considered Croatia to be far ahead toward its westernization. In 1995, when the CEFTA, the Central European Free Trade Association, was formed, Croatia refused to join the CEFTA. We don't want to join the CEFTA because we are already part of Europe. But this already part of Europe didn't materialize. Practically it meant that we were thinking that yes, by mentality, by identity, we might be part of Europe, and we are now defending Christianity against the Orthodox, against the Serbs, and one day against the Turks and against the Islam. So practically, Croatian-led forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina started to fight against the Muslims. So that's how the Croato-Muslim war started, because we were thinking that we are going to defend Christianity, but Christianity didn't exist at that time in the forms of the medieval Christianity. There were no Turks at the gates, there were only the Serbs Orthodox, and of course accepting the preposterous idea of the division between the Western and the Eastern world, of course, by the famous Huntington, Samuel Huntington. We put ourselves at the gate of the Western world. And it meant that we were not preparing at all to adapt to a European community, or at that time the European Union. In 1999, when the war finally ended, It ended in 1998 with the reintegration of Western Slavonia into the Croatian territory. Practically, the European Union launched a very ambitious program. It was called the Program of Western Balkans, the Stabilization and Association Agreement process, trying to drag the post-war countries of former Yugoslavia to the European Union. And then, of course, instead of the classical Copenhagen criteria adopted in 1993, widened with the Madrid criteria in 1995, which meant a whole set of criteria for applicant countries, the East European tradition countries, the European Union adopted a new set of criteria for the Western Balkans. This was first the full cooperation with the Hague Tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Second, the return of refugees to all the places where from they were displaced. Third, the establishment of regional cooperation between the countries of former Yugoslavia, more or less following the model of the Visegrad countries. And of course, the complete observance of human rights and especially the rights of ethnic minorities. Croatia was faced with these additional criteria, but it didn't comply. First, it didn't comply with the International Criminal Tribunal of The Hague because it didn't process its own criminals who committed during the war crimes against the Serbs, against the civilian population, against the Muslims, because the war was a defensive war for Croatia, but in these defensive wars there were war crimes committed by the Croatian military and paramilitary forces. So the Criminal Tribunal of The Hague asked for a responsibility by those who committed these crimes. Second, of course, there was the question of the full observance of human and ethnic rights, which was not at that time fully complied with. And of course, the most critical criteria was the regional cooperation. Croatia refused to establish regional cooperation, and instead of that, it said we are going to establish bilateral relations with the countries that are the followers of former Yugoslavia. Fortunately, in 1999, President Tudjman died, and in a new elections in the year 2000, a center-left coalition won. As a sign of goodwill, the European Union organized the first summit of the European Union outside the borders of the European Union in Croatia, in Zagreb, giving by this a strong signal that practically there is only one possible road for the countries of the Western Balkans if they want to live in peace, and this is the peace project of the European Union that functioned with the French and the German in the aftermath of the Second World War, but it's not sure whether it would function with the Balkan countries. That was a big dilemma. So, a slow journey started towards the European Union. There were some misunderstandings. The new government, center-left government, in order not to alienate the population still pervaded by strong nationalist ideas, decided to play tactically, so they decided to leave those who were incriminated for war crimes to flee the country. For instance, General Gotovina and some of his colleagues. Then secondly, they didn't want to establish regional cooperation on a multilateral basis, but succeeded to negotiate with the European Union to use a very strange formula, the so-called establishment of regional cooperation by a network of bilateral relations, which is not known in international relations, that you can identify regional cooperation in this way. But anyway, this was a compromise that the European Union was willing to accept in the case of Croatia to show another sign of goodwill. So the European Union was, in fact, showing signs of goodwill in many cases. Then, of course, the situation went better with the recognition of human rights and the recognition of rights of the ethnic majorities. For instance, in the new parliament, the Serbs were proportionally represented with 3 members of parliament, autonomously elected by them, which was a turnover from the previous decade. So practically, even a constitutional reform was approved by which 8 members of ethnic minorities were representing these ethnic minorities in the Croatian parliament. 3 from Serbia and 1 from all the other ethnic minorities, including the Italians. So that the Italians have now 1 deputy from their ranks. There was also 1 from the Roma, 1 from the Bosniaks, 1 from the other minorities. Anyway, practically there was a kind of change in policy. So practically there was another point of contention, and this was the idea of the European Union to drag all the countries of the Western Balkans together to the European Union. Croatia fought against this idea, and so the European Union made another sign of goodwill at the so-called Thessaloniki summit in the year 2003, when it decided that each country will be judged upon its merit. So practically there will be not a convoy towards the European Union from the Western Balkans, but a regatta. Who arrives first will become a member. And of course the European Union elaborated its platform for the negotiations. The negotiations started in the year 2004. The candidate status was granted in the year 2004, and in the year 2005 started the negotiations. In the meantime, the government has changed, but maintained its allegiance to the idea of Europe. The only problem was that the new government was again recruited from the ranks of the old nationalist party led by President Tudjman, but now Europeanized and reformed, modernized. So practically it appeared as a modern European Demo-Christian party. However, this was just a tactical device. Why? Because during the negotiations, and my friend Professor Bešker told you which were the main problems, the judiciary, corruption. The problem of corruption appeared as the first problem, because the corruption during the 90s that was introduced in Croatia became endemic for many reasons. And of course, one of the toughest criteria was the fight against corruption. In the year 2006, during the negotiation, Croatia had to adopt a strategy for the fight against corruption. But of course, it was not enough. 2 years later, during the negotiation, the European Union concluded, it took 2 years, that this strategy is very vague and very general, that practically it should be implemented. That therefore, this strategy needs an action plan. And in fact, an action plan was passed in the year 2008. After 2 years of negotiation, the European Union decided that this action plan is very nicely worded, nicely formulated, but there is no mentioning of who is doing what and when is doing what. Practically, there are no indications for implementations. So in the year 2008, in the year 2009, Croatia finally adopted the final action plan and strategy in the fight against corruption. But the problem was that the forces that were leading the negotiations against Croatia later on were subjected to court prosecution for corruption. So in the year 2013, eventually, the court case against the former prime minister that was leading the negotiations with the European Union was sentenced to 10 years for corruption of jail. And there are two other processes pending upon his head. And one will be, of course, for the overall corruption of the political party in power. His political party, this modernized nationalist party that now appears to be a modern Christian Democrat party, member of the European People's Party, and wearing a nice European suit. The problem, of course, is that these are the contradictions of Croatia, but Croatia did it. Finally, in the year 2013, there was an accession treaty signed, and the ratification went on. What did it mean? It meant that the ratification will follow, but of course pertaining that Croatia maintains its rigorous battle against corruption, that it maintains its rigorous battle against a corrupted judiciary, a politically dependent judiciary, because in the 90s the Tudjman's regime practically laid off all the judges from the communist era. This was a kind of silent lustration, and put in their posts a young generation of lawyers, but very subjugated to the political power, very much dependent on the political authorities and political will. Therefore, it was a non-independent judiciary, unlike here in Italy, where some politicians say that you have a too independent judiciary. But anyway, this is a problem of approach. Now Croatia will enter the 1st of July the European Union, and it will turn a new page, as I said. This new page means that we are now very well aware that we are not joining an old type Europe of between the First and the Second World War, but a new project of Europe to which we want to adapt. And for us it is basically of a strategic importance because we adhere to the basic values of the European Union. And we have to remind which are these basic values, because the technocrats and the eurocrats themselves sometimes forget which are these basic values. These basic values are first peace. The European Union should guarantee peace. Second, the peace is not the absence of war. It should be a state of mind. But to be a state of mind, it has to be a state of the body. Therefore, the second goal is the well-being of European citizens, the progress, the material progress of the European citizens. And third, there is solidarity. If somebody is in some difficulties, the European Union should solidarily help this member of part of the European Union to overcome the difficulties, which was not seen in the last years when a kind of egotism prevailed in the European Union, and a clear division between those who are developed and those who are less developed, or let's say the Nordic countries and the Mediterranean countries. Now we have to forge a new unity of the European Union and to make it viable through to the implementation of its own values. Another, last but not least, is the value of human rights and democracy. It must be a democratic polity. What is the European Union? It's neither an international organization nor a federation. It's a polity of, let's say, sui generis, as the theoreticians would say. Probably it would become a federation eventually, and there are many strong pushes toward a federation. Croatia is entering the European Union in the hope that its membership will help to overcome its, let's say, backwardness, because you notice that per capita income is less than 75% of the per capita income at the level of the European Union, which is 18,000 euros, which will mean that we will profit from taking part in the division of the structural and cohesion funds. In practice, there are 4 billion euros reserved for us in the budget of the European Union for projects that should enhance a faster development for Croatia, so reducing the gap between Croatia and the other countries. But of course, Croatia is also willing to adapt and to harmonize with the legal and political system of the European Union, because these negotiations helped us to overcome all the black spots and all the pathologies of our transition. Croatia didn't have one transition, it had two transitions. The first 10 years of the transition were totally lost in space, unfortunately, because of this authoritarian nationalist regime. After that, from the year 2000, we started an attempt of a real transition. This attempt of real transition brought many contradictions and many problems. For instance, as you noticed, and as Professor Bešker said, from an industrial country we just passed to a deindustrialized country with a tertiary service growing up. Instead, we closed many factories and opened many commercial centers, and after the financial bubbles exploded, now there is no credit in order to sustain this consumerism that practically meant a certain jump in the well-being of the Croatian population, but unfortunately with the world crisis, and we are well integrated in the world economy, and especially in the European economy, we suffered from all the backlashes of this globalization and euroization, which meant also the problems of the euro and the lack of an efficient stability mechanism to control the countries that adhere to the euro. For Croatia, basically it's a question of achieving peace, but we cannot achieve peace until the other part of the Western Balkans, of former Yugoslavia, will not be entering the European Union. Therefore, our serious intention is to help all our neighbors, starting from Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia and Kosovo, to start their own trips, their own journeys to the European Union, because we are sure that in that case, peace, real peace, will be maintained in the Balkans, and in Europe without a Balkan as a zone of peace will have a black hole in its belly, in its stomach. And this is not, of course, profitable neither for the European Union nor for us from the Western Balkans. Therefore, we are envisaging the continuation of the enlargement process, and we want to give a substantial contribution and help our neighbors to drive faster towards the European Union. Secondly, of course, we want to adapt to the European standards of human rights and observance of democracy, and therefore we want to join a more democratic European Union. When I say more democratic, then I mean less bureaucratic and less technocratic European Union, as unfortunately it proved to be during the period of the authorities of the bankers and of the financial capital that unfortunately prevailed in the European Union in the last years of the last decade. Hopefully now there is a common will to move forward and just to get rid of all these financiocratic, let's say, burdens, and the burdens of the bankers who practically press the European Union to save the banks, not the people that were affected by the economic crisis. This economic crisis should be solved in the way that the population is helped, not the banks. Therefore, to make a healthier financial system doesn't mean to help the banks, but to help the people just to develop a self-sustaining new economy that will be viable and that will be profitable and not subjugated by the banks and by the financial capital. Therefore, we are looking, well, I would say with a Gramscian outlook. We are in a way pessimistic by knowledge, by knowing what is going on, pessimistic by intellect, but optimistic by will. We are sure that the European Union will manage to preserve its own mission in Europe, and it will manage to overcome the existing problems, difficulties, and inner contradictions. And I hope that in this way we shall also help to contribute Europe to find its own better identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this very interesting and straightforward, I would say, speech. And now give the word to Professor Benki.
Don't worry. Just like. So, thank you so much to be so many today here for such a conference. I have to thank again Ambassador Grubiša, because anyway he offered us a very honest picture about the long journey that Croatia experienced since the moment of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. I know Ambassador Grubiša since, in fact, that time, and in a sense we also experienced together in different, how to say, in different moments, this long journey. So it is not only something which is related to, how to say, the scientific, academic knowledge that everybody can take by the books, by the manuals, but it's something which has been also part of our life, and this is something which I feel myself very, how to say, very deep in my way, my approach. So it has been very honest the way Ambassador Grubiša described what's happened in Croatia and in the area, in the Yugoslav area during the past 20 years. Actually, Croatia is joining the European Union in one of the most critical moments of the journey that the European Union also started more than 20 years ago. Because more or less, as we in many occasions speak about during our classes, the moment of the creation of the European Union is in fact the moment of the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Both how the events are in fact connected each other as how to say, the integration, the will of integrating Europe within the European Union has been part of how to say, the need and the dream to overcome divisions in Europe because the Cold War, but at the same time provided also divisions in Europe. For example, in the Yugoslav case, due to, how to say, as Professor Grubiša mentioned before, due to a very mistaken idea about what Europe would be and the role played by nationalism as the way to, especially in some part of Europe, to reconcile the identity of Europe at the moment of the end of the Cold War. So actually, Croatia is joining the European Union at the moment in which apparently nationalism or the nationalization of domestic policies in Europe is growing up again, because facing the financial crisis which is affecting the European Union since at least 2007 is in fact provoking rationalization of the policies in Europe, which in many occasions reminds me the time of, how to say, the long Yugoslav crisis of the 80s, when in fact the Federation was trying to find solutions to its own domestic economic crisis, which was in fact also the result of a general crisis, economic and financial crisis, which was affecting the most developed countries in the West, but also Yugoslavia, which was strictly connected to Western economic system. And the nationalization policies by the entities, by the republics in Yugoslavia, reminds me many times the nationalization policies that some of the member states of the Union are adopting in order to find solutions for escaping this dramatic financial crisis, which is affecting, of course, the relationship between elites, leaderships, and public opinion. So Croatia is a very small country, as you've seen and you watched by the slides provided by Professor Beschker, and of course could be very non-influential in a sense if compared to countries like Germany, like France, like the UK, that usually are the countries which are leading European processes and European policies. But at the same time, Croatia could play a very paramount role due to the fact that geographically Croatia is now the border of Europe in the most problematic area that Europe is trying to manage since the beginning of the integration process of the European Union. We have not to forget the fact that during the Maastricht negotiations during summertime 91 was also the moment in which it was the first attempt to ceasefire in Yugoslavia because the collapsing of the federation. So, meanwhile, there were the negotiations for the creation of the Union, of the European Union. It was also the moment in which there were the first attempt to stop, to prevent the possibility of a violent disruption of the country, of Yugoslavia. Those negotiations failed, unfortunately, but in fact, on one side, we learn enormously from the mistake made by European policymakers at the time. We mentioned in many occasions during our classes, but also today, Professor Grubiša again argue about the fact that human rights protection, minority rights protections has been immediately posted as the most relevant issues in the way of promoting for the promotion of the enlargement, but also within the member states. Because we have not to forget that in the end, the enlargement process implied also for the member states to apply human rights and minority regulations in a modern and different ways. The case of France is one of the most relevant. France has been obliged in the end to recognize its own minorities when in fact France refused up to 2004 to do such a job. And this has been because the fact that imposing human rights protection and minority rights to countries like Croatia has been then reflected also within the European Union. So, Croatia could play an enormous role on one side, as Ambassador Grubiša said before, helping the other countries of the so-called Western Balkans area to find the right track in the end for their own journey to Europe, towards Europe. I have to say that probably the first signs of that are already, in some evidence. The fact that Serbia and Kosovo joined for the first time an agreement which is mostly symbolical in a sense than practical, is part of a collateral effect of the Croatia integration into the European Union. There is no need anymore to postpone, the transition process in Serbia, in Kosovo, in Macedonia. So, taking knowledge about the fact that the past is over, in a sense. It is possible to look differently to the future. So Croatia could play an enormous role on that, supporting the other countries. Bosnia needs enormous support by Croatia for the future. Bosnia is a very problematic country, probably the most fragile in the area. Croatia played a crucial role in the past in the events which produced the crystallized situation of Bosnia nowadays. But Croatia could become a very positive partner for Bosnia, not only because Bosnia is the first commercial partner for Croatia, but also because the Croats in Herzegovina, as well as, the need to reform the Dayton Agreement in order to give a real chance to Bosnia to join the European Union, finding a new constitution for the country, could be achieved, could be joined thanks to the help that Croatia could provide to the country, mobilizing the domestic political forces, which can be helpful in the process. The same is, in a sense, of course, with Serbia, and again, a positive approach in the relationship with Serbia could offer the opportunity for Serbia to be legitimized definitely as the country which would join Europe in a foreseeable future. Then it is also in the interest of Croatia, of course, to have not only peaceful neighbors, but also, cooperative neighbors like Bosnia, but mostly Serbia, as Serbia for sure will be one of the most relevant countries in the future in economic terms for the development of all the area. So without the involvement of Serbia into such a process, a confident transition process towards Europe, it will be also, problematic for Croatia in the future to have problematic neighbors, unstable neighbors. So it is quite, of course, we have to follow the conclusions by the ambassador. We can be pessimistic by intellect because, of course, we know all the mistakes and the contradictions and the prejudices, as well as also, the falsity of part of the history, or at least of the perception of the history. But at the same time, we must be optimistic because otherwise we cannot escape from, a tragic destiny. Slovenia is another neighbor which is actually in very problematic moments. This is, could appear bizarre at the moment in which Slovenia joined the European Union at first, in the first wave, with, sometimes a sense of superiority towards the other former entities of the Yugoslav Federation. But actually, again, Croatia could be a positive partner for Slovenia too, at the moment in which Slovenia must solve some of its own problems, which are in fact, again, the achievement, the results of the transition process that Slovenia experienced in those 20 years between the collapse of Yugoslavia and the joining of the European Union. So in the end, it's true that the only way to escape from the criticism, the critic situation that the European Union is facing now, and the only way to give a future for the Western Balkans in the perspective of the integration within the European Union is only through the implementation of democracy within the European Union, which means in fact that we need to move into a different type of perception of the European Union. Actually, in the major countries of the Union, the more than half part of the public opinion is very skeptical about the capacity of the European Union to deal with the economic crisis and to find positive solutions. This implies that Euroscepticism is growing up everywhere, but this Euroscepticism is based on the perception, on the lack of trust by the public opinion, by the peoples, because in fact they are feeling themselves as passive entities within the European Union. They are voting for parties which are in fact not dealing with the European affairs in a lot of ways. There is a discrepancy, a gap between the local level of participation in the domestic countries and the way the European Parliament is working. So actually this is something that Croatia could again push within the European Union, together with the other member states. Paradoxically, actually, the most optimistic countries within the European Union are the newcomers, the new member states. Still, in the public opinion in the new member states are in favor of the continuation of the implementation of the European deepening process, and it is again because the mistakes done during the enlargement process that actually we are in the paradoxical situation that the West is in crisis and the East is pushing for the implementation of the Union. Again, Croatia could become one of the relevant actors in the future due to the limited size of the country, because to be close to one of the most problematic areas, which could be solved only through the democratization of Europe and the overcoming, definitely, of nationalism in Europe, thanks to a supranationalist approach, could be the right answer to overcome, definitely, nationalism in the Western Balkans. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Peliter. And now questions.